My name is Paul George. Normally I introduce myself as Director of Peninsula Peace and Justice Center, but today I'm very happy to introduce myself as a member of Peninsulans for Corporate Regulation. Now, that's kind of a funny sort of name. That was an ad hoc name just to put this event together. Ad hoc is Latin for awkward and confusing. But we have been working together as a group for quite a while. P4CR, as we've come to refer to ourselves, is a group of local residents concerned about Supreme Court decisions that have granted inalienable rights, the same rights that you and I have as individuals have, to corporations. We work to educate and mobilize elected officials and the general public about the need to adopt the 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Amendment, yeah. This is not going to be a hard sell today, is it? An amendment that will say corporations are not people and money is not speech. This is, of course, part of a growing national movement. There are national organizations, one of which we have represented here today. There are local organizations, much like our own Peninsula-based group. And it's really a movement about growing awareness of the issue. What the heck is corporate personhood anyway? My spell checker still doesn't recognize it. When it does, we'll know we're making progress. So that's what today is all about, is educating and mobilizing. We hope you'll join with us. You'll hear more about that as the program goes on. First of all, I want to take a moment to thank, first of all our volunteers who came out and helped set up today. We had 30 minutes to set up this room because there was a dance class in here before, and look what they've done. It's a great job. Thank you, volunteers. I want to thank the staff at Lucy Stern Community Center. They've been very helpful. And as always, Congresswoman Anna Eschoo's staff has been great. Thanks for all the help. So with that, we will get into our program. And the first presentation is going to be from Ted NACE, author of Gangs of America, The Rise of Corporate Power and the Disabling of Democracy. He's going to talk about the history of this idea of corporate personhood and how corporations became people. Ted has been thinking about corporate power for a long time. While working for the U.S. Forest Service during high school, Ted learned about the plans of several major corporations to develop coal strip mines and other energy projects near his hometown of Dickinson, North Dakota. During graduate school, Ted worked for the Environmental Defense Fund, where he helped develop computerized simulations that demonstrated the investor and ratepayer benefits of replacing coal-fired power plants with alternative energy programs. The simulations led to the cancellation of a multi-billion-dollar coal-based power complex proposed by 2 California utilities. Nice work on that. Yeah. After completing his graduate studies, NACE worked for the Dakota Resource Council, a citizens group concerned about the impacts of energy development on agriculture and rural communities. Eventually, Ted ended up forming his own corporation. He was the founder of Peach Pit Press, the world's leading source of books on computer graphics and desktop publishing. And I imagine there's a few people in this room here in Silicon Valley that are more than familiar with Peach Pit Press. As his company grew and eventually incorporated, Ted found himself reflecting on the corporation as an entity, one that seems to take on a life of its own. His reflections led to his writing what has become probably one of the best books for understanding how corporations got so much power in our society. Please welcome Ted NACE.
I want to thank all the groups that brought this together. I understand there's quite a coalition going on down here. It's sort of like Saturday morning in Palo Alto. I think the last time I was in this room was in 1974 when I came out to Stanford and I played a chess tournament here at the Lucy Stern Center. I should say that I live in San Francisco, so this is a journey to Silicon Valley. And my daughter said, "Are you going to make a TED Talk?" So for me, it's all TED Talks. Anyway, so I've been asked to give a short history of the idea of corporate personhood. Before I get started, I guess I don't have to remind this group about the relevance of all of it. Corporate personhood or corporate rights may sound like a really abstract thing. And if you're trying to discuss it with other people, it's often hard to get the whole discussion back to actual ground. But what we're really talking about is corporate power, and we're talking about a handful of large corporations and the small number of people who run those corporations being able to wield what amounts to a veto in the political process. So, for example, studies released in 2009 showed that about 2/3 of the public supported the idea of single-payer health care. But in the actual legislative process, that idea was considered beyond the pale because it was realized that corporations in the healthcare business had the ability to veto anything like that. So it didn't even get into the discussion in any real way. And that same corporate power can be seen across industries, giving oil and coal companies veto power over climate legislation, military contractors tremendous power to block serious cutbacks, banks veto power over financial reforms, and so on in industry after industry. Most crucially, because it goes to the source of their other powers, corporations and trade organizations such as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce have shown the power to block even simple transparency measures for disclosure of political spending, as Congresswoman Eshoo is well aware, much less any more serious regulation. So how did this situation come about? Now, I'm sure this audience, everyone's aware that we're talking about court rulings that happened giving corporations equal protection due process under the 14th Amendment back in the Gilded Age. Sort of vague language, equal protection, due process, but very powerful when interpreted by sympathetic courts. And it wasn't just the Santa Clara case. There was a cluster of cases, Munn, San Mateo, the Beckworth case. I'm not going to really get into detail on those particular rulings, but I do want to talk about the context in which they came about, because they didn't just come out of nowhere. Basically, what happened in the courts in the Gilded Age can't be understood unless we really look back earlier. And one of the most striking things, if you read what people were saying well before the Santa Clara case, was this extremely, just a climate of skepticism and even hatred of the corporate form in America. And it was generally felt that corporations were really the equivalent of the social structures in Europe that everybody was trying to get away from. So, for example, in 1835, Alex de Tocqueville wrote, "The friends of democracy should keep their eyes anxiously fixed on an industrial aristocracy, for if ever again permanent inequality of conditions and aristocracy make their way into the world, it will have been by that door that they entered." So that was 50 years before Santa Clara. 20 years before that, Jefferson said pretty much the same thing, almost the same choice of words. He said, "I hope we shall crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to a trial of strength and bid defiance to the laws of our country." You can see this anti-corporate spirit even before the American Revolution. And in fact, a credible case can be made that the Revolution itself was something of an anti-corporate uprising that was triggered by measures passed by Parliament in 1772 designed to rescue the East India Company from a fiscal crisis. So that story goes back a couple years before that. There was a famine in India that cut into the company's revenues in India. At the same time, there was a depression in Europe, and the East India Company was looking for new revenues. They got Parliament to give them a waiver on taxes for sales into the colonies, and they also got Parliament to give them what amounted to a sort of a Starbucks franchise, a monopoly over sales of tea in the colonies. So from that point on, officially only certified merchants would be allowed to sell tea, certified through the East India Company. Now, it's interesting to read that history because, we hear the Tea Party talk about taxation without representation. The taxation without representation slogan was flying around the colonies after 1765 and the Stamp Act, but it wasn't really getting traction, and it didn't get traction until Sam Adams and other of the radicals were able to bring the business community into the fold, and their motivation was that they were afraid that if the East India Company was able to do this with tea, they could do that with all the rest of the commodities, and the future economic course of the colonies would become just a raw material supplier, and that the actual development of business in the colonies was really threatened by it. So this business of equating the Tea Party with the right wing of the right wing values of the Republican Party is bizarre if you actually read the history. Well, after the Revolution, the topic of what to do with corporations was a topic at the Constitutional Convention. And it's interesting because Benjamin Franklin was a big advocate of corporations because he was a big advocate of big infrastructure projects that would catalyze the economy. So he proposed that there be an article in the Constitution that allowed the federal chartering of corporations to do things like build canals. But most of the delegates didn't want that. And they felt that this would just be the seed that grew into another East India Company in the United States. So they had very clear ideas about corporate power at that time. And the delegates had already come with instructions on what to do with any kind of corporate empowerment in the Constitution. So that idea was raised twice at the Constitutional Convention, and both times it was rejected. And as a result, there's no mention of corporations in the Constitution because the idea was to leave all corporate regulation up to the states through the incorporation process. They wanted to keep it as close to the grassroots as possible. And they did that for many decades. They had very restrictive treatment of corporations. For example, chartering terms would only be for 20 or 30 years. Corporations were prohibited from owning property not directly related to their specific line of business. Every corporation had to declare a public purpose. You weren't allowed to just have a corporation to make money. You weren't allowed to own stock in another corporation. Corporations were kept in this sort of tight fence. And the whole idea was that they didn't want corporations to get out of the bag and become overwhelmingly powerful. So this was the cultural and the political and the legal context going into the 1840s and 50s when the railroads were starting to happen. And railroads were going to be interstate businesses, really the first big interstate businesses. And if you look at it from the perspective of the railroad entrepreneurs, they had a problem on their hands. And a lot of the things they did, if you look at it from their perspective, were pretty reasonable. So consequently, you had people like Tom Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad really going state by state, reinventing the corporate legal structure piece by piece. They had to get rid of all these sort of particular special incorporation laws and get a general incorporation statute on the books. They had to get rid of the limits on amounts of invested capital. They had to get rid of the limits on operating across state lines, on one corporation owning another. They needed to operate at a bigger scale. They wanted to build companies of a national scope. And to do that, they also had to push back at these populist movements, or sort of proto-populist movements that were happening then, like the Granger movement, which was trying to pass state legislation, allowing states like Minnesota to regulate railroads. They had a great ally on the Supreme Court named Stephen Field, one of our local California products. He came out of a family, you'd have to call them business visionaries, although they weren't all businessmen. Some of them were lawyers. But he had one brother who was one of the group that was laying the transatlantic cable. Another was a railroad attorney, and he himself was very closely connected to Leland Stanford. And he was just a big believer in this new kind of big national economy characterized by big national scale corporations. So he wrote, almost religious fervor for this new kind of economy. He wrote, "There's nothing which is lawful to be done to feed and clothe our people, to beautify and adorn their dwellings, to relieve the sick, to help the needy, to enrich and ennoble humanity, which is not to a great extent done through the instrumentalities of corporations." So he really wanted to, he was the John Roberts of his day. He wanted to really empower corporations quite deliberately. He came to the Supreme Court, and if you look at the pattern of cases, there was just a deliberate strategy unfolding, and he built it around the 14th Amendment. He wanted to broaden an amendment which had been written to empower or to protect the freed slaves. He wanted to broaden that to include corporations. Give pro-corporate justices some kind of tool that they could use to overrule state legislatures. So many of you have probably heard about the quirky circumstances of the Santa Clara decision. In a nutshell, the decision that is regarded as the precedent for corporations being considered quote-unquote persons under the 14th Amendment, actually, when you read the decision, which was written by Justice Harlan, there's no reasoning for that conclusion. That conclusion was added on, sort of slapped on by the court reporter, ex post facto, saying, well, this is what they said on the bench. This was an oral statement by the Chief Justice. In a way, it's not really relevant because in subsequent cases, the Supreme Court justices, they were mostly railroad attorneys. They were happy to start using that precedent. So in that way, the circumstances, these quirky circumstances, aren't relevant. But what is unfortunate is that because they never really explained their reasoning, it allowed this sort of personhood precedent to be used in all kinds of very broad ways in the future. And no one ever had to go back and defend the rationale. So it's kind of like if you have a family secret. Because you can't talk about the dysfunction, you can never really correct it. And as it turns out, the rationale was actually stated very clearly by Justice Field in another case called San Mateo, which was almost identical to Santa Clara. They were folded together, but the rationale was laid out at the appeals court level, so it's not part of the precedent. But the rationale is this. It's what scholars call the associative theory of corporate rights. The idea is that if you have a group of people, and each of those people enjoys certain rights, then by extension, those rights, particularly property rights, should pool together just the way the property is pooled together, so that the corporation, which is the joint property, should get the same protections. And it's intuitively obvious to someone like Field, because the way he saw corporations operating was these sort of groups of buddies starting these companies together, raising the capital, and it was just this sort of consensus thing where the corporation really was the people. And it's an attitude that even you see today. Someone like Mitt Romney gets asked about corporations. Are corporations persons? He says, of course corporations are persons. He said, literally, corporations are people, my friend. Of course they are. Everything that corporations earn ultimately goes to people. It's this kind of 1% attitude that it's just us. It's sort of it's really saying that a corporation is the same thing as a family business or an unincorporated partnership. It's just a group of people. The problem is that the whole point of inventing the corporation was that these traditional business models were inadequate for a lot of things that people wanted. So, for example, just to live longer than the life of the owners, just as one example, and there's many more. The problem is that so formally a corporation is a legal entity that's not the same as the owners. It's distinct. Now, the problem is you're creating a new kind of property that's different from regular property, like a horse. A horse, if my horse knocks down somebody's door, I have to answer it in court. But if I own stock in ExxonMobil and I read that ExxonMobil has devastating sub-region of the world, I can just turn the page. It has no effect on me. So all kinds of advantages accrue to corporations because of this being able to legally incorporate. They can morph, they can split, they can do all kinds of things. Due to these advantages, due to these advantages, legal theorists have been criticizing the idea of corporate personhood for a long time. But rather than undoing it, what we have now in the Citizens United era is extending these ideas from just being about property to being about First Amendment rights. And here's where the logic gets really stretched. This is the whole new campaign that happened since the 1970s. So it wasn't the Gilded Age that gave these rights that we're now talking about. It happened in the 1970s and more recently with Citizens United. I'm going to really quickly summarize, what Justice Palo was trying to do is really, once again, just like Justice Field had done in the Gilded Age, literally trying to re-empower the corporation, feeling that the government regulation of corporation had gone too far in, with environmental and consumer regulations. So, why is this such a radical leap? The reason is that, however tenuous it was in the first place to equate personal property with corporate property, at least with corporate property, we have a notion that's comprehensible. With corporate speech, we presume that there's a speaker. But in a corporation, there are three distinct groups that you could call speakers. There's management, there's stockholders, and workers. Those three groups. Well, forget the workers, for starters. But even the stockholders, right now, under corporate governance law, stockholders don't even have the right to know what the corporation is spending politically, much less to control it. But then when you think about it, managers themselves don't really have any freedom to spend this money either, because they're legally required to simply operate in accordance with corporate maximization. So really what you have is you have corporate spending in the political realm on automatic pilot, and it's the farthest thing from a First Amendment situation of free speech. Well, most Americans aren't concerned or don't care about all these legal technicalities. They don't care about this history, but one thing is clear is that according to the Gallup poll, 67% of Americans say that major corporations have too much power. Because this is a power issue. And the interesting thing is this isn't a partisan issue. It goes right across the spectrum. 56% of Republicans, 69% of Democrats, 69% of independents, and 73% of Democrats. People don't understand exactly how this power has come about, but they do know illegitimate power when they see it. And what impresses me about the movement that we're seeing is the connection people make between the power that they viscerally despise and what they're beginning to see as a solution through a constitutional amendment. And it's not, to me, it's not just compelling how many states and municipalities have adopted resolutions. It's also the lopsided nature of the votes. 75% in Montana. That's a red state if I ever saw one. When I was in Colorado, I found people talking about a corporate personhood measure being placed on a referendum, and all kinds of other groups were trying to get their issues on the referendum too, so they could ride on the coattails of the popularity of overriding corporate rights. So I'll just conclude by saying I think we've actually hit sort of a tipping point here, and the attendance in this room is evidence of that. This is thrilling for me. It's an exciting moment in history. We have activist public servants like Congresswoman Eshoo, and we have public activists like Peter, and all of you who've taken the time to be out here, of your busy lives, to be here today. So all I can say is keep on fanning the flames, and thanks again for inviting me here.
Our next speaker is Peter Schurman, and Peter is going to talk on more about where Ted kind of left it off. What do we do to reverse this situation? Peter Schurman serves as the campaign director for Free Speech for People, one of the leading national organizations taking on this question of how do we address the problem of immense corporate power. Free Speech for People works to challenge the misuse of corporate power and restore democracy to the people. They work to advance the movement, to amend the U.S. Constitution, to overturn decisions like Citizens United, and to end the fabrication of corporate constitutional rights. They also engage in legal advocacy to confront the misuse of the U.S. Constitution to claim corporate exemptions from our laws, which damage our communities. Prior to joining Free Speech for People, Peter was the founding executive director of MoveOn.org. You might recognize that name. It's a way cooler name than Peninsulans for Corporate Regulation. Did you make that up, by the way?
Did not.
Oh, okay. Well, we won't hire you for our branding then. Peter has also has extensive previous experience directing national and regional advocacy campaigns and building organizations, having served as national student organizer for the Sierra Club, New England Clean Air Coordinator for the American Lung Association, issue organizer for the State Energy Communication Council. The list goes on. Believe me, it's a really long list. Peter has dedicated himself to a life of activism, and we are grateful for his work, and we are grateful for his time today. Please join me in welcoming Peter Schurman.
Thank you, Paul, for that introduction. Thank you, Ted, for setting the groundwork so well. Thank you, Congresswoman Eshoo, for joining us here. Thank you, Debbie, for organizing today's event, and thank you all for being here. As Ted said, it really is terrific to see from just how full this room is what the level of energy and interest is in confronting this problem of out-of-control corporate power that we have in America today. Free Speech for People is a national, nonpartisan organization founded on the day of the Citizens United decision 3.5 years ago. The bulk of our mission is to help lead the fight to overturn Citizens United and an earlier case known as Buckley versus Vallejo. Buckley versus Vallejo, which was decided in 1976, essentially said that political campaign spending is a form of constitutionally protected free speech, and so it cannot be limited by law. It is laughable on its face, but it's been the law of the land for my adult life and frankly been a really destructive force on our democracy. What it basically does is privileges the wealthy few over everyone else. Makes it so that if you're Meg Whitman, you have a shot at higher office, but if you're Jane Q. Public, good luck with that bake sale, unfortunately. Citizens United decided in 2010, of course, said that corporations have the same constitutional rights, First Amendment rights, as people. And that ruling is best known for its practical effect, which was to open the floodgates to unrestrained political spending, the development of super PACs, the explosion of 501c4 groups. So it has had a hugely detrimental impact on our campaign finance system. It blew the McCain-Feingold Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act that so many of us worked to pass in 2002 right out of the water and basically said anything goes. The other thing that Citizens United did was it was the most extreme extension of the corporate constitutional rights doctrine that Ted sketched out so clearly. And it extended a corporate veto over this growing doctrine which has established a corporate veto over so many of our laws. Ted talked primarily about a corporate veto in the practical sense of, if ExxonMobil, or more specifically, if Chevron comes into our last elections as they did with a $2.5 million corporate campaign gift, which was previously illegal. They can have a huge impact on the race and scare off challengers and scare existing representatives away from taking stands in the public interest for fear of alienating these potential corporate opponents, for fear of drawing an advertising onslaught against them in their next election. But what's lesser known is that the notion that corporations have constitutional rights has also had a more direct effect, as in effect a corporate veto over public interest laws. There's an example that I like to cite which goes back to before Citizens United, but is a core example of exactly this problem. The Amistoy case in Vermont was a case in which Vermonters decided that they wanted to have labeling of their dairy products. If the dairy products were produced from cows that had been raised and treated with bovine growth hormone. You could understand a small agricultural community-based state like Vermont really wanting to know what's in their dairy products. Dairy, of course, is a huge part of the Vermont economy. So they passed a law that said, if you're producing dairy products for sale in Vermont, you have to simply tell us on the label whether these cows have been treated with bovine growth hormone. Public interest, democratically enacted law. This is what our democratic system is supposed to enable. Well, what happened was that the Vermont Dairy Council, if I remember the entity correctly, took the state of Vermont to court and said that the corporation has a constitutional right not, as part of their free speech rights, not to disclose on the label whether or not these cows had been so treated with bovine growth hormone. So in effect, this is a direct corporate veto over our public interest laws. When corporations have constitutional rights, what happens is the law may come into conflict with a claim of a constitutional right, and because constitutional rights are so powerful, they embody the sacred values that define America. They're basically our national DNA. They have trump power in the courts to overturn any law that comes into conflict with them. So it doesn't basically matter what laws we pass if corporations can wield this veto power to throw out any law that they find inconvenient to their bottom line. This has also happened in respect to cigarette labeling. Corporations have used the same claim of corporate constitutional rights not to speak when they choose not to invalidate laws calling for graphic health warnings on cigarette packages and to overturn laws banning cigarette billboards within a certain radius of our public schools. So it's really quite reprehensible, the effects of this doctrine. And that, in our view, is really the core of what Citizens United is about. It's known for its effect on political campaign spending. The campaign spending really is mostly goes back to Buckley versus Vallejo with an extension as a result of Citizens United. But Citizens United is really, in our view, about the doctrine that corporations have constitutional rights, a false, fabricated, fictitious, and really, really dangerous idea, which we have to overturn. And since both of these cases were passed by the Supreme Court, were decided by the Supreme Court, Buckley versus Vallejo and Citizens United, the only way that we can overcome them, unless we're willing to sit and wait another generation or two for the makeup of the Supreme Court to change and for them to change their minds, as prescribed in the Constitution under Article 5, is for we the people to stand up and say no. This is a democracy. We the people have the ultimate say here. And under Article 5, we can amend the Constitution to say and make it clear exactly what it does say. We need to have political equality for all and government of, for, and by the people. We've got to amend the Constitution again now. And to overturn Buckley, we need an amendment that says that Congress and the states have the authority to limit campaign gifts and campaign spending in all categories. And to overturn Citizens United, what we need is a constitutional amendment that says that corporations simply do not have constitutional rights as if they were people. Categorical. Well, those applause are terrific, and they make my next point beautifully, which is what's so great about this is how strongly people support this idea. So, and you're all a great demonstration of that. Ted touched on some of the polling on this, but there's really even more dramatic polling. Our polling shows that 79% of Americans across the board support a constitutional amendment to make it clear that corporations don't have constitutional rights. And that includes 68% of Republicans, as well as 82% of Democrats and 82% of independents and 87% of Democrats. That's almost 4 in 5 Americans. It also shows that 66% of small business owners see Citizens United as bad for small businesses because it gives the big guys with the corporate advantages the right to run roughshod over everybody else. Better still, we are making serious progress toward enacting an amendment. We've come remarkably far in 3.5 years, especially when you consider the scale of the challenge. Article 5 of the Constitution says that we can amend the Constitution by getting 2/3 of Congress plus 3/4 of the states, 2/3 to pass amendments of the Constitution and then ratification by 3/4 of the states. What those numbers come out to is 67 U.S. senators, 290 U.S. representatives, and 38 states. Those are pretty big numbers. But the great thing is that depending on how you measure it, we've already come 1/3 of the way there in just 3.5 years. There are currently 28 U.S. senators, more than 1/3 of 67, who have co-sponsored amendment bills to overturn Citizens United. There are 97 House members, which is a third of 290, including Congresswoman Eshoo, I'm happy to say. Who have courageously stood up and co-sponsored amendment bills calling to overturn Citizens United. There are now 14 states, which is more than a third of 38, that have formally called for an amendment, most of them by passing state legislative resolutions, including California, calling for an amendment to overturn Citizens United. The other states that have done so are Colorado, Connecticut, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Maryland, Montana, New Jersey, New Mexico, Rhode Island, Vermont, West Virginia, and just yesterday, the 14th state, Illinois. Just yesterday. Of those states, almost all of them acted through their legislatures. But last November, on Election Day, 2 states, Colorado and Montana, held statewide popular votes on the question of supporting a constitutional amendment. And as Ted mentioned, he stole one of my best lines, they both voted by 74%. That's nearly 3-to-1 popular votes calling for constitutional amendments to make it clear that corporations do not have constitutional rights as if they were people. That's, again, a margin of almost 3-to-1. In the same vein, the voters of Los Angeles, just a week and a half ago, at the same time as they elected a new mayor, also voted by more than 3-to-1 to call for an amendment. Los Angeles is now one of nearly 500 states, cities, and counties across the country that have made that call. But there's another important point about Montana that Ted also touched on that I want to come back to, which is probably the most important point of all. When you consider how polarized this country is, how divided our government is, how paralyzed our government is, and then you consider that everything that we're unable to do in Washington today is blocked at lower thresholds than even those we need to achieve for an amendment. If you consider the level of supermajorities that we need to accomplish for an amendment, 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states, there's really no way ultimately to get there without real bipartisan support, such as our polling shows. And that is why it's so incredibly heartening to see that Montana voted 3-to-1 for a constitutional amendment while also voting for Mitt Romney by more than 10 points. It just proves beyond any doubt that the American people are ready to stand up and demand this change. Across party lines, everyone wants this. So now it really is just a matter of getting the rest of our elected representatives on board. And with your help, that is what we're setting out to do. Thank you very much.
Well, the old saying goes that our next speaker really needs no introduction, and I think that's probably true since she's been representing us in Congress for 21 years and well representing us in Congress. I just want to say one quick thing. First of all, how grateful we are that Anna is here today, taking time out of her really busy schedule. It's incredible. And she is here. When we first went to meet with her to talk about this, we had all kinds of talking points laid out. Didn't need them. She was enthusiastic, right on board, and very conversant with the issues. We're proud to have her here. Please welcome Congresswoman Anna Eshoo.
Good morning, everyone. How are you? It's great to see you. There's so many longtime friends I see in the audience, and I didn't get to see everyone. But this is very exciting to have this room filled with constituents that care so deeply about this issue. So I want to begin by thanking Paul George. I want to also acknowledge the marvelous remarks, how highly instructive both Peter Sherman and Ted NACE have been. I want to acknowledge all of the organizers. As Paul said, this started at a meeting in my office of a coalition of individuals representing, their respective organizations. And I said, well, why don't we do a town hall meeting so that people can come in from the community And here we are today. But I didn't do the organizing, they did. So bravo to the organizers. If this can be organized here, then we can organize the country and change the system. I also want to acknowledge a longtime dear friend, former mayor of Palo Alto, served on the Palo Alto School Board, went on to serve at the County Board of Supervisors here in Santa Clara County, went to the state legislature, served in the Assembly, in the state Senate, and now happily has come home and is on the Board of Supervisors, Joe Simidian. Joe, thanks for being here. Thanks for being here. And I understand another former mayor of Palo Alto is here, Peter Dreckmeyer. Where's Peter? I didn't see him. There you are. And everything good, Peter is there. And I understand that Claude Ezran, the chair of the Palo Alto Human Relations Commission, is here. Thank you very much for your service. Let me just make a few quick comments before I get into what I wrote out on this very broad subject of where we are. I think the ground has been covered very well in terms of the histrionics of it, how we got to where we are today, this mess that we're in today. By saying to you that you all know that I do telephone town hall meetings, and I've been doing them for some time. I think I was the first member of Congress to begin the telephone town hall meetings. They're extraordinarily popular. And the smallest number of people, and we either cluster communities or do one large community in terms of the outreach. But the smallest number of people calling in is around 7,000. And it goes up to 9,800. Imagine that in terms of the interest. This topic of Citizens United, I mean, people know the case, and in every single telephone town hall meeting, now that doesn't include the mail, emails, cards, notes, letters, faxes, people talking to me in the community, people coming to meet with me in my office. This issue comes up every single time. Every single time. So there is broad and deep interest. There is broad and deep support, as Ted said, and people understand what this is doing with this disastrous decision of the Supreme Court. I think it is singularly one of the worst decisions that any Supreme Court in the history of our country has rendered. And the damage is very deep and broad. Now, I want to talk a little bit about disclosure, because disclosure is a disinfectant. It doesn't do the whole job. We know that. But disclosure, I think, is very important, and then go on to some other things. So I want to begin by reading a quote to you, and I wonder if anyone in the audience will be able to identify, not including the panelists, be able to identify who said it. And this is the quote: "Evil corporate and private affluent influences are well enough checked so long as adequate campaign expenditure disclosure rules exist. By the politicians' fear of being portrayed as in the pocket of so-called moneyed interests." Any guesses? Antonin Scalia. Antonin Scalia. Now, I was at the Italian embassy for a wonderful gathering because it was a national celebration in Italy. Excuse me for not remembering it. And it was very lovely to be invited. And the justice and I were seated at the same table. And I raised this with him. He quickly turned to the person that was seated on the other side of him. But at any rate, the words of of Justice Scalia came from a 2003 dissenting opinion from McConnell versus the FCC. Now, that was a challenge to the McCain-Feingold ban on soft money donations. Now, Justice Scalia is probably the most ardent opponent of campaign finance laws on the Supreme Court, and yet even he acknowledged that the crucial role of disclosure in political spending, how important it is. Now, Justice Scalia, and many people don't know this, and I found it fascinating myself, so I want to share it with you. You may not know this. Justice Scalia joined 7 other justices in supporting added disclosure rules to counter the new influx of money as a result of the Citizens United decision. Why? I mean, I think we all know why. Because money has become the eye of the storm when it comes to policy making in Washington. And so there were other justices that joined with him in supporting disclosure as they supported and voted for, in the majority, the Citizens United case that was handed down. So in the last election cycle, I mean, this is so illustrative. In the last election cycle, there was $7 billion, that's with a B, $7 billion spent to fund political candidates. The most spent in our country's history. $7 billion. The president's campaign was $1 billion to be reelected. $1 billion. A study of the Federal Election Commission data revealed that the top 32 super PAC donors, these are individuals, the top 32 super PAC donors gave just as much money to the 2 presidential candidates as all national small donors combined. $313 million to be exact. Now, you see how the wheels have essentially come off. In other words, only 32 donors matched the contributions of 1.6 million people. Pretty far out of whack. And because of our weak disclosure rules, many of these special interest donors will never be disclosed to the public. The Center for Responsive Politics says that there was over $500 million in undisclosed contributions to federal campaigns in the last election cycle. So I think you already know what this means in terms of members after they get elected. All you have to do is look at the recent debate in the Senate over background checks for gun purchases. I mean, I think that Wednesday of maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, for you, certainly for me, was really a very, very depressing day when over 90% of the people of our country, regardless of their political affiliation, including members of the NRA, supported background checks. No one's going to convince me that those votes reflected the fear of members understanding that big money would come after them in their next election cycle. I mean, it just is, to me, I think it's just as clear as day. So obviously, this isn't democracy at work for the people. But listening to Peter and to Ted, we know that we can fix it because our Constitution allows for it. Now, the good news is that between the last Congress, the 112th Congress, and now the 113th, there are some 13 constitutional amendment pieces of legislation that have been introduced. Now, in 20-plus years in the Congress, this is a first. I don't ever recall that number of constitutional amendment legislation. And the framers really, I think, built a rather steep hill, as you heard described, to amend the Constitution. This is not an easy thing to do. And I think they made it purposefully so, because as the flag is the symbol of our country, our Constitution, which we take seriously, is the soul of our nation. So there is a very high standard, and I take seriously going on to legislation that would amend our Constitution. But I think that that's good news, that between the last Congress and this one, altogether 13 bills were offered. Now, in the short term, Congress and the administration can and should require more transparency. I mean, it really, sunshine is a disinfectant. And when people know, now, Joe, you'd have to help me with this. What proposition was it a handful of years ago that was on the ballot in California that was the campaign against, well, it was a campaign to undo the higher clean air standards and emissions in California, whatever the number of that proposition was.
But it was Prop 23.
Okay, all right. Well, whatever number it was, in California, there is a requirement in the political advertising, in the voiceover at the end, that this ad was paid for by. And when people in California heard those ads, and they were on like every 9 seconds, it seemed to me. I mean, it was a huge campaign in terms of the money that was spent to buy these ads. But when people heard who paid for them, the oil companies, you really didn't need to have a campaign to counter their campaign. People got it right away. So when I say disclosure is powerful and it is a disinfectant, it is. It can and it does work. So I think that we really need to have more transparency in political spending, and there are a number of ways that we can achieve this goal. Now, right now, there is this huge controversy about the IRS, and the findings, obviously, are troubling. I don't think anyone can defend something that's indefensible, and I think it's very important for Congress to have the oversight hearings on a bipartisan basis. There's outrage. The IRS is a very, very powerful agency. So whether you're left, right, or center matters not. That is not the business of the IRS to be delving into that. But this controversy, I think, goes beyond mismanagement in the Cincinnati office. It's also about the outcomes of Citizen United and how big donors and corporations can hide their political spending through sham nonprofit organizations. Now, here's something that's very interesting. Going back to the Eisenhower administration, the 501c4 exemption in the tax code read in the following way: civic leagues or organizations not organized for profit but operated exclusively for the promotion of social welfare. Exclusively. All right? Now, along the way, starting in, I believe, 1959, the IRS changed the word exclusively to primarily. So what does this mean? Layer on what Citizens United held, where money is speech, corporations are people, was figured out. And there was a flood, some 70,000 applications to the request of the IRS to come in under a 501c4. And you see what's happened with that. You see, I gave you the numbers, the figures. And what I think, borders on or criminality, except they can hide under this thing, is that this is secret money and secret donors. So we have next to no transparency in terms of disclosure. We have Citizens United. We have a section of the IRS that changed the verbiage, changed the word to primarily, and then those taking advantage of it. I mean, this is serious. It's one of the most serious messes I think we've ever been in. One of the most serious messes we've ever been in. This has to change. This has to change because the way it's operating now, you, myself, and the taxes that we pay are subsidizing political activity in the country. I don't want my tax dollars to do that. If I want to donate to the Democratic Party, and I do, you want to donate to someone, that's terrific, but I don't think we should be subsidizing that with our tax dollars at all. I think it's just wrong. I don't care whether it's a labor organization, whether it's the Sierra Club, whether it's the Tea Party. I don't care who it is. I have to tell you, I don't want to subsidize them with my tax dollars, period. So this has to change. This has to change. It has to, the IRS, it's either the Congress that has to step in to change the words or that they instruct the IRS to go back to the original words in this. It's very brief. I read it to you. It's very brief, but that one word from exclusively to primarily. You're going to leave it to agents in Cincinnati or San Francisco or Miami or wherever they are to figure out what primarily means? You see what's happened. And, of course, they went overboard. I mean, when you read the questions that they were asking of people, anyone with common sense would know that it was just plain wrong. So we've got a problem there as well. Now, where are we going with this? I know that disclosure is a short-term fix. I do think it's important, and I've zeroed in on it. The committee that I'm on has jurisdiction over the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, that has the authority to implement disclosure. Believe it or not, it's a huge fight with them. It's a huge fight with them. I launched, and thousands of people in this congressional district marched with me on it, filled out the cards, sent them to the president, and said, at least require everyone that is granted a contract with the federal government. This is all taxpayer dollars. Not as a requirement in order to obtain a contract, but once they do, because it's the best and fairest price and whatever it might be, that they then are required to disclose who they contribute to, because they're taxpayer dollars that are in that contract, that are paying for that contract. Now, the president sidestepped that. He hasn't done that yet, but I'm going back at it with him because that is probably represents over $1 trillion right there of taxpayer dollars in the business that the federal government does. Now, as Ted said, I've signed on to a constitutional amendment, and I'm going to examine two that he pointed out to me, and he gave me a very good list that does a compare and contrast. The one that I signed down to would reverse the Citizens United decision and allow Congress to regulate campaign contributions and expenditures, including banning all corporate campaign expenditures. I've co-sponsored, this is Joint Resolution 31, which would permit the Congress to impose content-neutral limitations on campaign contributions and spending, as well as public financing for elections. And this is something that I've been on since you first elected me to the Congress. There are days when I allow myself for maybe 30 seconds to try and imagine what it would be like in our country and to serve in the Congress where there is no money whatsoever. I mean, imagine the changes in policy. Imagine the changes or the likelihood, the high likelihood of changes in Congress if there were not dollars attached to that. So I think we have to have transparency and disclosure because it is a disinfectant. It does cast sunshine on what's going on. But the ultimate change, lies with the power of people, with the citizenry of our country. I have no doubt that here in our region, and certainly in my congressional district, that with an informed citizenry, you're already informed. We don't have to work hard to inform people. It's there. It's there. I know, in terms of people speaking to me, over and over, people are worried sick about this. And along with that worry on the part of some is a sense of helplessness, that they don't count, that their vote doesn't count, that the system is beyond repair, and they always pose the question, is there anything that I can do as an individual citizen about this? I mean, there's almost a pleading in their voice about it. And I'm not saying this to be melodramatic. I'm conveying to you what has been shared with me. So a constitutional amendment is really the clearest path to overturn Citizens United. And so we need to be united in doing this. I think today is a great start. I mean, on a gorgeous Saturday where people could be doing 1,001 other things, farmers market included. You can go tomorrow, too, though. I think that is the path forward. So I want to thank the original group that came to my office. So inspiring and hopeful, and all of you that have turned out, because you really strengthen not only my hand, but the hands of all of those that really want to move forward as volunteers to do this. This kind of a showing today demonstrates that we can do it, And we have our own work to do in our own backyard, our own state. I know during the presidential election there were many people that came forward to call into Nevada and Colorado and all these other places because we knew that California's numbers were good for the ticket. But we need to take care of California, our state, and position our state to be one of the states that comes into the column that was mentioned earlier. So how proud I am to represent a community of constituents that care so deeply about this and are willing to roll their sleeves up to do it. I'll be right there with you. You know that. And we can look forward to some of the things that I described where I think those that voted for Citizens United will maybe huddle in some small room over at the Supreme Court and say, damn, they did it. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so here's always the best part of these meetings. This is from Lisa Hicks. Most of the people in the room are over 50, and the effect of Citizens United will clearly impact those over and under 50. So how do we engage those under 50 to understand and work to change corporate power? Demonstrate its applicability to young people's futures. Okay? Who wants to take that? I mean, I have my ideas, but I've been talking for a long time. Yeah.
Mostly you, Ted. Well, with respect, I basically disagree with the premise of the question. I think young people self-evidently have the greatest stake in the future and the most willingness to change the received status quo. We see strong support from young people in this movement, and I think we'll continue to see that.
I agree. I think, I don't agree with the basic premise, Lisa, because young people have a much clearer vision, an unobstructed view of where they want to go and where they want to land. And the old paradigms of, yes, this is all right, but this is tweaked, and then you get under this, and then you go there. Remember the Johnny Carson thing where he'd go to the map, you take the 485, and then go to the whatever, and it was all convoluted? They're not into that. They have extraordinary clarity about what works and what doesn't. They're sick of our system not working. They really are sick and tired of our system not working. So they're not attached to party labels either. They're not so inclined to be. They just want to see things work. So this has to be at the top of their list in terms of getting somewhere to make things work. So thank you, Lisa. All right, this is from Valerie Kockelman. Our U.S. Congress is populated by paid lobbyists for various interests, Republicans as well as Democrats. How can we stop them? Well, I'll take this first. The Congress has made an attempt to slow down the revolving door. And what I mean by the revolving door is members of Congress leave, they're hired by the corporate interests that used to come and lobby them, or they know so much in terms of the knowledge that they gained as a committee chairman on the Transportation Committee. Imagine a chairman of the Ways and Means Committee and the access that that person has had to information over the years, and the key staff, and it's key staffers too, even more so for key staffers. And they're hired, and you can see the lobbying that's going on to try and unwind Dodd-Frank, to reform the financial industry. So what can we do about it? You have to tighten it up. Or even prohibit. There's a prohibition of 2 years now. Maybe they should make it 5 years, and that would slow them down. I don't know constitutionally if you can just ban it. That I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but I don't know the legal answer to that. But I think if you can throw more sand in the gears and keep them from doing it for 5 years, then they'll go seek employment elsewhere. Does anyone on the panel want to add to this?
I'd just add that a great deal of the lobbyists' power comes from their treasuries, from their bank accounts. And the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act of 2002, McCain-Feingold, was a serious attempt to limit that, and a strong measure to do that, and that got thrown out, as we know, by Citizens United and related cases. So a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United really is a good answer to that question.
This is from Ernie. I'm not so sure. I'm good with handwritings, but C-H-I... Chohurt? Okay. Given your experience in Congress, can you speak to those areas where corporate power has negated good policy in the area of energy, et cetera, types of fuel, generation, et cetera? Oh, sure. I mean, that's, the fights over even raising the fuel standards. I remember years ago offering, and I was new, it was beginning of my second term. I had just gone to the Energy and Commerce Committee, and I thought, I get to do it. I'm going to offer an amendment because the fuel standards had not been raised for like almost 2 decades. So Ed Markey and myself, who will be the next new United States Senator from Massachusetts by the end of this, in a handful of weeks. At any rate, we offered an amendment that had the strictest standards. Now, this is a huge committee of, 53 members, including our 2 votes. We got 5 other votes. Imagine that. That's Democrats and Republicans. This is before Tea Party and all that business, all right, when we had somewhat normal people there. Then we offered another amendment that was not as restrictive, but it was still a good, solid amendment. Including our 2 votes, we got 11 votes. The bells rang, had to go to the floor for votes, and I remember one of the members coming up to me and they said, "Are you sick today? You look ashen." And I will always remember those 2 votes. It was 7-11. And so it was such a comeuppance for me. I mean, if I had any green around my ears, I'll tell you, it was shed that day. It affects everything. It affects everything. It affects everything. I was just talking to Chris Dodd. I called him to wish him a happy birthday last Monday. And I said, "Chris, it's a minor miracle that you even got that bill through the Congress, because there were tens of millions of dollars that were spent lobbying against it. And so, of course, there were parts of it watered down, but it still passed. Now, there are probably hundreds of millions of dollars that have been spent, still being spent, the lobbyists that go into the regulatory agencies, the executive branch, and all of that, to water it down even more. Now, that's just one example, but it's everywhere. It's everywhere. There isn't any shortage of money by corporations when they want to kill something or weaken it. So it's it influences everything. It's not just one. This is from Jules Brulé, who writes to me very frequently. Should Justice Thomas be impeached by the House for his brazen conflicts of interest in campaign finance causes, including Citizens United and the FEC? It's an excellent question, Jules. I did a letter to the Justice Thomas, along with several of my colleagues, asking him to recuse himself from voting because of the income that his wife derived and they both live from, and the Supreme Court does not disclose. Imagine that. So he did not answer our letter. But it is brazen. You're absolutely right. It is a direct conflict of interest. So I'll send you a copy of that letter, Jules. All right, this is from Uwanda Benson. Corporations have the same rights as people. Has any effort been made to enumerate the inalienable responsibilities of corporate personhood? That's a good question. Corporations buy their way out of any trouble they cause. I, as a citizen, do jail time for all kinds of, would have to do jail time, I think. That's what you meant to say. Would do jail time for all kinds of damages I cause to my neighbors or to my civic institutions. Would the real threat of jail time cause the corporate managers to stiffen their backbones against corporate actions that take people's property, despoil the environment, or appropriate the right to water or land, cause people's impoverishment, et cetera, et cetera? Well, it's an excellent question. Right here.
Yeah, I'd love to take that one.
They're all excellent questions.
They are. This question is right on. I mean, you have to have accountability for corporations, and the crux of the corporate definition is essentially to limit liability, but it doesn't mean eliminate liability. There has to be accountability, and there too often today there simply isn't. The reason I took this question is because I wanted to let you know about another key part of the work that Free Speech for People does. which is to challenge the out-of-control growth in corporate power. In particular, there was a very, very tragic case that I'm sure we've all read about 2.5 years ago in West Virginia, the tragic explosion of the Upper Big Branch mine owned by Massey Energy, in which 29 coal miners lost their lives.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very interesting case because, despite the tragedy, it's somewhat unique because the former governor of West Virginia convened an official inquiry, an official report that found the corporation at fault for those 29 miners' deaths.
And they'd been cited many times before.
They've been cited numerous times before. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has called Massey a criminal enterprise, and he's absolutely right about that, for violations of the Clean Water Act, all kinds of violations. What's interesting about and also it's the case, as the questioner, as Yolanda asked, about what about if the executives start going to jail? Well, believe me, the executives in that corporation are starting to go to jail, and they're starting to flip and turn state's evidence against the higher up executives, and it's kind of a fun thing to watch unfold when you think about the need for accountability. But more to the point than that, what we are doing here in that case, the first case we know of, is we are actually calling on the Attorney General of Delaware, where Massey is chartered, Beau Biden, the Vice President's son, to revoke the corporate charter of Massey Energy, which is the corporate. Which is the corporate equivalent of the death penalty. I mean, it's a fictitious entity. You just yank their charter, they're gone. And it's the kind of thing we need to do in a lot more cases. This is the only such effort that we know of that's ever been attempted. It's currently pending before Attorney General Biden of Delaware. If any of you have family members in Delaware, call them and urge them to urge Attorney General Biden to revoke the charter of Massey Energy. It would send huge shockwaves through corporate America.
I'm going to organize some members of Congress to send a letter to him.
We would be delighted.
Yeah.
We follow up with you on that.
Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you.
Yeah.
Glad to hear that.
My time has expired.
We were told not to keep you over time. Thank you so much, Congresswoman Anna Eshoo.